preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I should like to follow the procedure this evening which I followed last week. That is to say, I should like once again to reduce a movement to a personality. And in doing so, I must once again take a person that might not normally be considered to be the heart of the movement. Last week, you will recall, I discussed with you the conservative movement, its strengths and its weaknesses, in the terms of Mordecai Kaplan. And I hope I indicated to you why many an American Jew feels that he can be both a Jew and a modern man, particularly a man of the technological and scientific advance of our day, by being a member of conservative Judaism, and in particular if he should follow the point of view of Mordecai Kaplan. Now tonight, as we bring this series of lectures to an end, I should like to do the same with Reform Judaism, and I hope to do so through the person of Martin Buber. I would imagine that there would be many people, particularly among Reform Jews, who would be surprised that the Reform Jewish movement should be discussed in terms of Martin Buber. But from my point of view, and as I hope I shall make clear to you shortly, Martin Buber belongs within the Reform movement, and if he has to be connected philosophically or intellectually with any group in Judaism, it is Reform Judaism. Moreover, the strengths and the weaknesses of Buber's way of looking at Judaism reveal precisely the advantages and the difficulties of Reform Judaism. And therefore, while I may be doing a little disservice both to Martin Buber and to Reform Judaism, I think this will be the easiest way to proceed. Remind me, however, let me remind you, however, now that I've reminded myself, what it is that we're driving at. You will recall that our theme here has been, what does it mean to be a Jew in the modern day and age? What, since the end of the Jewish Middle Ages, what, since the emergence of the Jew from the ghetto, in the broad sense of that term, into general society, can it mean to be both a Jew and a man of the modern world? Now, we've explored that from so many angles that I don't want to review them now. But where we stand at this stage of the course is that in the 150 years that this problem has been before Jews, the two major answers, the two major living answers which have been given are either Zionism, and by Zionism I am following Ben-Gurion's line, meaning residence in the state of Israel, or one who is soon to take up residence in the state of Israel, or religion, a liberalization of religion, a change and adaptation of the Jewish religion of the late 18th century to something which could suit into the modern world. I guess, therefore, we began with Reform Judaism in discussing this answer, and it is therefore perhaps not inappropriate that we end it with Reform Judaism, even though that may not be the point of view which you yourself take. Now, Martin Buber, I am sure, would himself be shocked to think that he has been identified with a particular movement in Jewish life. That is because of his entire approach to religion. His entire approach to religion seems anti-institutional, anti-organizational, anti-anything which exists outside of the human being. He is, if anything, the essential point of view of Reform Judaism carried to its furthest conclusion. And that basic point of view is essentially non-Orthodox. It will be easier if I clarify it from that point of view. The Orthodox Jew, as a matter of fact, the Orthodox believer in any religion, is a man who believes that the essential truth concerning the world has been revealed, has been given. It's available. Whatever the truths are which God has established for the world and for mankind in its destiny, they are known to us. God has given them to us. It was very good of God, and it was gracious of him indeed to make this known to us. And the Orthodox believer wants to know where he can find this in his book. But he knows he has the book. He has the instruction. He has the guidance. Now that's the traditional point of view in Judaism, and it's the Orthodox point of view in any religion. Martin Buber starts from another point of view, as do all the liberals. You remember many months ago we discussed how the liberals took the point of view, if God had given the law to the Jew, if God has said what the Jewish religion was, who could change it? It made no difference whether the Jews were in the ghetto or out of the ghetto. If it was God's law and God's way of life, explicitly and in detail, how can anybody deal with it in any way so as to tamper it or deform it or change it? Now, the liberals, therefore, have to start with another point of view. They have to start from the position that the truth is not exterior to the person. It's not that the law is outside of you. It's not that there's a book which knows the truth, or a tradition which knows the truth, or as in Roman Catholicism, a church, an institution which knows the truth. No. Somehow, truth finally has to be within the individual. It may be his conscience, it may be his mind, it may be his inspiration, but it's within. Sooner or later, he may want to study the tradition, he may want to know the tradition, but the tradition isn't binding on him. It's only helpful. It may give him guidance, it may give him direction, but the final solution is what he himself can believe, what he himself is willing to undertake. Now that's the basis, of course, upon which the Reform Jews proceeded to introduce changes in Judaism. They felt that there were things in the modern day and age that God didn't really want them to do. They didn't think it, to give a specific example if I can, they didn't think it made terribly much difference to God whether some of the prayers were said in German or in Hebrew. That God could hear the prayers in German as well as in Hebrew. They didn't think, for example, that God himself really would be terribly disturbed if the women were allowed to sit with the men during the services. That this wasn't a divine injunction, but a human injunction. And it was because of what they felt inside themselves that God wanted of them. It was what their minds told them, what their consciences told them, that they felt they had to make these changes. Now, Martin Buber starts from this general position. Only he has carried it forward in such a way that it has illuminated all religion. It's really quite remarkable to what extent Martin Buber is read and studied by Catholics and Protestants. I'm not quite certain what his influence is in Muslim circles, but he's a man who has had such an enormous impact on all kinds of religious thinkers in our day, that I think you ought to understand that the first part of what I'm going to say is not directly concerned with Judaism. It is, in a way, a general theory of religion. A liberal theory, to be sure, but a kind of a general theory of religion, and then I shall go on to the Jewish part of it. And then from there we will be able to see what both the advantages and disadvantages of this point of view are, and from them what some of the advantages and finally the disadvantages of the Reform Jewish definition are. Now, Martin Buber begins with this basic question which I have just asked and carries it on in some considerable detail. And that is, how do we know there is a God? If the law has been given and it's perfectly clear, you know it from the tradition. But Buber can't accept that. He may be willing later on to find God in the tradition, but he feels that we have to somehow relate it to the individual and his experience. How can a person know that there is a God? This is obviously one of the key questions of our time. But Buber is willing to start back even further. And while he doesn't raise the question in exactly this form, for very good reason from his point of view, I'll ask the question from a point of view that I think we can understand. He would start with the question, what do you mean, how can we know God? How can we know anything? Well, let's start with anything. How do you know anything is there? Well, let's take an example. Perhaps we will take this table behind which I stand. How do we know the table is here? Well, it's fairly clear how you know the table is clear. You look at it. If you want to get even nosier, you can come up, you can feel it. You can taste it, smell it. We can measure it. We can weigh it. We can take it apart. We can discuss the various layers of it. If we don't like what we see on this side, we can turn it upside down. It's fairly clear how we know the table is there. We know the table is there by simply examining it and using our senses and our minds in relationship to it. And unless one wants to get terribly persnickety, you know the table is there. And it's a very valuable form of knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge that we use almost all the time. Our lives are built upon such knowledge. Our science is built upon such knowledge. The world is built upon a knowledge which has to deal with things like this table. But the next question is that the only way there is of knowing something? Well, it may be terribly important, and it may be the basic way of knowing things, and it may indeed be the way which we use almost all the time. But is it the only way? Now, supposing we take a person, a human being, an individual, and treat him the same way we treated the table. Perhaps you have had the experience of going in to talk to somebody, something on your mind. You wanted to tell them, but you didn't know them terribly well, and you hoped somehow that you would be able to get through to them. And you're trying to get through to them, and in the meantime, they're looking at you. They're looking at your shoes. If you're a lady, they're examining your hose to see whether the seams are straight. They check the hem on your skirt. If you were a gentleman, they take a look to see the way your tie is knotted. Did you take a close shave? They examine you to see whether you've had a haircut. They look for stains on your garments. They take a look at the wrinkles around your eyes to see how old you are. And you're talking and trying to get to them, and they're looking at you, examining you up and down. Now, what is the feeling that you have under such a circumstance? You have a feeling of terrible frustration because they don't want to look at you. They don't want to somehow get to know you. All they're interested in doing is, they treat you like you're a thing, an object, a nothing practically. Because your body isn't the real you, and the way you arrange your hair and the way you have managed to get wrinkles and the rest, that isn't you. That's not the real you at all. And it's a terrible nuisance when they won't pay any attention to you, and they'll only pay attention to your outsides. Now, says Buber, if that's so, how do they get to know the real you? How do people ever get to know not just the body of another person, but the person, himself, that thing which was somehow just missing in the experience that we went through? Well, says Buber, it sometimes happens that you do know people that way. If you look back in your experience with people, you will recall, probably, a certain time with anybody when you had some kind of contact with them, may have been speaking, may have been not speaking, in which you had the experience that you understood that other person, and that other person really understood you. There was a moment, nobody knows quite how long this lasts, maybe it lasts a long time, maybe it lasts a short time, when there was really a sense that you understood them and they understood you, and there was real contact and communication between the two of you. Now, of course, such a thing is a little difficult to describe. Why is it a little difficult to describe? Because you can't watch it. Now, most Americans, when they carry out their business, they're watching. Part of them is taking part, and the other part is watching to see what they're doing. They don't want to make mistakes. They don't want to say the wrong things. They don't want to give the wrong impressions. They split themselves up into little pieces, and one piece is on the outside doing the talking and the behaving and the being nice, and the other piece is watching, making sure that nothing wrong happens. Now, that's all well and good, but if half of you is watching and the other half is talking, then the other person can't really get to know you at all. All they can get to know is the little piece of you that's taking part. And that's our big trouble. If we really want to be known as ourselves, we have to put our whole self into it. Can't hold back anything. You just have to put your whole self in terms of the other person. The other person gets to know you and you them. Not just your mind, and not just your way of speaking, and not just your way of carrying your head, but you. And that means all of you, unfortunately. Therefore, if all of you is involved, none of it can be standing out at the side watching. And if you can't watch, how can you remember what went on? And that's the trouble. The really important moments are moments in which you are so busy taking part that you can't make notes about it for later. And this is what bothers most Americans. They want to be safe. They want to be sure. They want to know quite precisely and exactly what happened. And they're so busy watching, half of them watching and half of them taking part, that they never act spontaneously as whole and honest people. But sometimes we do. Sometimes for no good reason. Maybe because we're not watching so carefully. In the craziest places, under the craziest circumstances, you're walking for the subway, and the crowd is going by, and you're looking at the crowd, you look at the faces, you figure maybe you'll meet somebody, maybe you won't meet somebody, you know how those things are, and you're looking at the faces, and all of a sudden you see somebody, and you reach out to them with your eyes, and you say, "Do I know you?" without a word being spoken, of course. And the other person looks back and says, "Do I know you?" And the two of you meet there, in the midst of all those hundreds of people, and all of a sudden you say, "Oh my God, I don't know you, get out." And they say, "I don't know you either, get out." And quickly you avert your gaze and look away. Now for a moment there was a sense of meeting. It didn't last because all of a sudden the fact that you were in this situation destroyed it for you. Now multiply that by all the possibilities of getting to know people. It can happen any time. Any place with anybody, a guy at a bar, or the fellow that runs the elevator, or somebody that you've known quite casually. Now, we like to think it happens with our dear friends more than often. And people who are in love, deeply in love, think that it happens very frequently. It's the basis of their relationship, as a matter of fact. But the most important thing that you have to understand about this is that it can't be forced, and I guess it's a second important thing, that not only can't it be forced, but the whole way of bringing it about and the whole way of bringing it to bear is something that can't fully be described. Now, why can't it be forced? You can't force it because you can't force another person to be present. All you can do is somehow bring yourself together. And sometimes you can't even bring yourself together. Sometimes you are so deeply disturbed in your heart that you just can't behave like one person. You've got to be split up into little pieces that keep arguing with itself all the time. And the other part of it is that it's nothing so terribly special that gongs go off, or as in the movies, the sun shines through a cloud and a golden sunbeam comes down on your head, or the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra is playing in the background with the violins going. We're not talking about mysticism now. We're not talking about anything which is a great, exalted experience of the kind that it's earth-shaking. It's meaningful and it's important. But it's not the kind of thing which is any way out of the ordinary experience. Now the problem is, if you are going to be very busy watching for this thing over the next few weeks, it can't happen. Because you'll be split up into two parts, and all of you can't take part in it. On the other hand, if you allow yourself to reflect on your experience over the next few weeks, perhaps you will see what I'm talking about. Because obviously I can't fully describe it to you, since I can't be watching myself while the thing is going on. Therefore, says Buber, there are two ways of knowing things. The one way of knowing things is to know objects. You look at them, you examine them, you handle them, you weigh them, and that's very important. It's what we have to rely on most of the time. But, says Buber, when you get to persons, there is another way of knowing persons. Don't misunderstand. You can use this first way of knowing, the way we know things, also to understand certain things about persons. If you want to study their anatomy, their physiology, their chemistry, very useful to examine them from that mechanical standpoint. But you never really get to know them as they are. A person who studies anatomy will never dissect a person, because he's looking in the wrong way. You don't find persons with a knife. It's impossible to discover a person in a cadaver. You're just working with the wrong tools. You can't tell what color something is by using a thermometer. You have to have the right way of looking for the right thing. Now, it may be very useful for medicine and even psychiatry and certain other sciences of man to look at man that way, but if you really want to get to know man, there's another way of doing it. And that is the person-to-person kind of knowing about which I have been talking. Now, I hope by this time you have asked yourself the question, what in the world am I doing spending so much time about how we get to know things? Because the answer is very clear. Once we understand how we know things, we can also understand how we get to know God. Now, what is the major problem with getting to know God? The major problem with getting to know God is most people want to find God as if he were a table. They want to be able to weigh him, to examine him, to have empirical evidence of him, to have proofs that he really exists. They want to be able to see him, to feel him. They want to be able to handle God as if he were a scientifically observable phenomenon. And no wonder why they get in trouble, says Buber. They are using a thermometer to try to tell what color God is. No, says Buber. If you want to know God, you have to know God in the same way that you know a person is there. This is not to say that God is a person, because that's a terrible sentence. Nobody even would know what it means. But what Buber would say would be this. How do you know God? You know God the same way you know persons. Now, what does that mean? It means two things. First, it means that that's the way you sometimes find God in the world. What do you mean? I mean by that. You're walking in the subway, and as you catch another person's eye, and you really know he's there, you don't need proofs about it, you don't need discussions about it, you had the experience of meeting him, so you can meet God. Where do you meet God? Well, where don't you meet God? If you are open, if you are available, if you are knitted together, you may bump into him any place. Why not? After all, he's supposed to be everywhere. And if he is everywhere, you might meet him everywhere. So why don't we meet God everywhere? Because the trouble is, we're too busy watching. We are watching ourselves so busily, we can't even pray out of a prayer book. Because half of us is watching. What are you doing with a prayer book? You, of all the people to go to a shul, what are you doing here? We can't even stand with a prayer book and pray. And then when we have a prayer book to pray, this creates other problems and difficulties because the words are not ours. But the same thing is true when we go about our daily concerns. We pick up a piece of bread, don't say a bracha, because what's God got to do with a piece of bread? We sit down to eat at a table and we're happy we've eaten, and we're thankful that we were able to get a decent meal for a change. And do we thank God? No. What's God got to do with the fact that we eat? We wake up in the morning. Do we look for God because we woke up in the morning? No. What's he got to do with it? It's my mattress, and I paid my rent, and I've been to the doctor. The whole attitude, the whole interest is such a different one that since we're not open, obviously he can't get in. Well, says Buber, why don't you do it the way the traditional Jew did? Or any religion for that matter. You hold yourself open instead of watching all the time and splitting yourself up into 100 pieces. Face whatever happens to you as a whole person and see if you don't find God. Some people bump into him in the forest, some people in laboratories, some people at art museums, other people when they read the newspaper, some people when they read the Bible. It makes no difference. What difference does it make? But that's the way you will know God. And remember, no gongs will go off, and no pigeons will flutter around your head, and there will be no violins. Nothing spectacular. As you know another person, so it comes and it's gone, comes and it's gone. It's a knowledge simply that there is a God. There is a second way Buber says that you know that there is a God. And the second way that Buber says that you know there is a God is quite simple. He says every time you really know another person this way, in the experience of knowing that the person is there, you also know that there is a God there. You know that there is not just you and the other person, but that there is something that stands between you and around you and underneath you and that upholds you. It's not just the two of you in the universe alone, but it's the two of you and that great, well, call it whatever you want to, that great person, that great thing, that great something which shares with each of you and yet is so much more than either of you. That is how Buber says we get to know there is a God. Now, this is very personal, you see. It's an experience that you yourself had, and if you haven't had it, it's quite difficult to prove it to you. But you don't prove that important things are really there. You don't have to prove the existence of your wife. And it's more just than her body or her nose or her skirt. If you really want to know whether your wife is there and you don't know, you can't prove it. And it's not a matter of giving definitions. No one was ever asked to give the concept of his wife or the definition of his mother. That's not the way you deal with this kind of an entity. You go out to meet them, knitting yourself up as best you can to become a whole person and see what you can find. If you find nothing, all right, you find nothing. But, says Buber, you will find that behind the universe, behind the world, there is this which you will meet, which you can come to meet, at least which it has been his experience that he has met, and which others following him have in a similar way experienced. Now, there's nothing Jewish in what I've said so far, as you can see. This is the kind of experience which any man could have. Could be a Protestant, could be a Catholic. He could even be an atheist, at least before the session, or whatever happened, and maybe even afterwards too, if he insisted on being stubborn about it. But this is something which is common to all religion, and it explains many of the problems that modern man has in believing. There's nothing about this which is unscientific. It doesn't believe that science is the way to find God, but that's what the scientists have been saying all the time. If you want to be scientific, the chances are you're not going to come to the conclusion that there's a God. Fine, says Buber. No quarrel. It's just the wrong way of going about it. On the other hand, it's not irrational. It's not unreasonable. Because after all, if you have to go out to find God somehow, and it's all of you, it includes your mind. It includes everything you've known, and everything you've studied, and everything that you're even going to study. All of you, including your intelligence, is involved in this. But your intelligence alone isn't enough. Your mind alone isn't enough. And it explains, too, what faith has to mean for a modern man. We sometimes think, and maybe it was true, who knows, that faith for a man of another century was something solid, unyielding, inflexible, something that he had all the time, that he could count on day after day and minute after minute. He could reach for it like a safety deposit book. No, a savings deposit book. He could reach for it and there it was. But a modern man doesn't seem to have that kind of faith. Even if he is a little bit religious, he discovers that his faith fluctuates. Today he believes, tomorrow he doesn't believe. One day he's convinced that there really is something, the next day he's filled with doubts, and maybe even in the course of a few minutes or a few hours. Now, Buber doesn't propose to solve that problem. He doesn't propose to say, if you do this thing, you will have such faith that you will never waver. Doesn't say that. Why? Because he knows these experiences come and go. A man can reach for his savings account book, open it up and look at the figure. But you can't reach for God that way, because he has to be met the way you meet a person and not the way you meet a thing. But does that mean you can't have faith in him, even though you can't be certain that every minute you can reach out for him and find him? No, says Buber, because that's not the way our relationships with people work. Let's take love. What is love? Now, maybe in the movies where the orchestras are in the background and where the gongs are going off and the lighting is always just perfect on the heroine and nobody ever has a cold or sneezes, maybe in this kind of a situation you can have that make-believe kind of faith. But it doesn't work out that way with real people. With real people, people who are in love discover after a while that sometimes there is real understanding and real compassion, and without even talking. Don't even need a word. Don't even need to move sometimes. Sometimes you just simply know. You know, and they know, and you know that they know. You know that they know that you know. And they know that you know that they know. But it doesn't happen like that all the time. Sometimes the shirts are in the wrong drawer, or God forbid there aren't any shirts. Sometimes things are dull. They are routine. And sometimes there is a real disagreement, and it doesn't have to be verbal. You're mad and they're mad. And there's no communication. It's cut off. And any attempt to break through seems to be met by a hostile barrier. A wall of electricity just stands there. And you can't get through. And you're still in love. How can you be in love even though part of the time the relationship is just living side by side? And part of the time there's actual hostility between the two of you. Well, now this is one of the problems of most English novelists. The British novelists love to describe the people who only live side by side and have no real relationship to one another. But Buber says, even with people who do love one another, the moments of doubt and disbelief can be endured because of the experience that has gone before. You've had the moments of compassion, of understanding, of communication, and you believe that they will come back again. You have faith that the moments will come back again because you've had these previous experiences. And the previous experiences have been so real, so meaningful. They've shown you what you are. More than that, they've shown you what you can yet be, what you ought to be. So that you are able to build a relationship with this person even though only a few occasions you are on the heights. And the same is true of God. God isn't always there. He can't always be there. Most of the time we live in the world of objects. Most of the time we're not ready to find God. But if you do find God on occasion, if you've had the experience, even fleeting, of knowing that God was there, it's an experience which has meaning for you. It changes your life and it changes your direction. It gives you some understanding now of what it really means to be a person. Because there is a God, and you as an individual person have been able to know it. So this would be a terribly helpful thing if it really could work out for individuals. But it's not the traditional Jewish point of view. It's not the way the Bible talks about God, and it's not the way the Talmud talks about God, it's not the way the rabbis talk about God. It's a point of view which is liberal, which is modern. Not that one still couldn't be an Orthodox Jew with this point of view. One could. One could if it finally led one to the Torah, to which we will get in a moment. But if I may say so, it is also a post-scientific point of view. You remember Mordecai Kaplan was terribly eager to show that the God idea had to keep pace with modern thinking, had to be adapted to the scientific and technological world in which we live. Martin Buber says, yes, it does. There's only one trouble. While God has to be meaningful in our lives, to try and find God in the scientific, naturalistic, pragmatic way is not to find God at all. You may find an idea, you may find a notion, but not God himself. You want to find God, you have to find God the way you get to know persons. So while Martin Buber is a liberal, his liberalism is first in the fact that he is willing to change from the tradition. But it doesn't mean that he has any less a God than the tradition has. To the contrary, from Mordecai Kaplan's point of view, he's far too orthodox. And this is, of course, the paradox with such figures, that on one respect they can be seen more traditional, on another hand they can seem too liberal. Now, what is Jewish about Buber's point of view, and where Buber is Reform, where Kaplan is conservative, emerges in the area of Jewish law. Because the relationship of the Jew to his God sooner or later has to become a question of Torah. What do we mean by Torah from this point of view? Or to take it back to our question of last week, can we turn on the television set on Saturday afternoon to watch a cultural program? This is the key question, of course. Now, from the Orthodox point of view, it's quite clear. We can't do it. God said, no making of fires, no turning of switches. From the conservative point of view, Some will say yes, and some will say no. We don't know where they stand. Kaplan talks as if it might be all right, but on the other hand, in terms of his own practice, he is too traditional to get involved in this kind of an act. Now, what is Buber's point of view? Buber's point of view is very simple. Where do the commandments come from? The Orthodox says God gave them in Hebrew, on Sinai, either directly or through Moses. Kaplan says God didn't give them. God doesn't give. God is there. Man creates them in relationship to the God that he finds in the universe. And this is a very liberal point of view, because if man creates them, then man can change them. Buber says, no, the commandments are not God's given to man, and they are not man's inventions in relationship to God. To the contrary, they are the result of the meeting of both man and God. Both are involved. Now, how does this happen? Well, let's go back to our relationship. I'll have to use the relationship of husband and wife, or of two close friends, or of people in love, because that's the closest analogy to this kind of thing. Supposing they spend some time together. They get to know one another. They feel that they have really had this kind of relationship I've described. Not every minute, but it's been there. When they've had that experience, the experience does something to them. They feel, I have to do something about it. I have to do something for the other person. I have to do something for society. I have to do something for myself. The experience of really getting to know another human being is a motivation to act. You have to treat them in a certain way. You can't just walk all over them. After all, you've gotten to know them as they really are. You can't let yourself behave in any way. After all, you're the kind of person that's had this sort of experience. There are things you want to do, things you feel you ought to do because of such a relationship. Well, says Buber, that's the perfect analogy to God. If you've had any kind of an experience of knowing that God is there, then as a result of that experience, you will feel that there are some things you ought to do. You ought to treat people in a certain way. You ought to do certain things with your own life, etc., etc. Now, did God give you those laws? In a way, he did. Because if God hadn't been there, you wouldn't have had the feeling that you ought to do something about it. On the other hand, did God tell you exactly what you need to do? No. Because this isn't the kind of communication in which there's talking. This is not the kind of understanding in which words pass. There's the other person and there are you. And what's most important is what isn't said, as I think you've probably found in your own experience with human beings. What isn't said, what passes between you, is really what's most important. And the same thing is true with God. Now, where does the commandment come from? It comes from you. The man creates it, but out of the experience. It's not just his alone. It's his by virtue of the experience. Now, at that moment, he may be willing to do things that the tradition says. In regard to a lady, for example, he might feel that the appropriate thing is to send flowers, to call her up, to write a letter. He didn't invent these. They're part of the tradition, and yet, on the basis of his feeling, he feels he needs to do something, so he uses the tradition in this regard. Now, the same thing could be true of individuals. The same thing could be true of people under almost any circumstance. And obviously, it's true of people in religion. But sometimes it's creative. Sometimes people invent new things to do. That is to say, they feel that they are, I'm not going to take one that's very creative now, because if I have to create something, it's impossible. But, they spend an evening together and they decide the thing they really want to do is to get bicycles and ride through Central Park at 3 a.m. That's the thing which will capture what they want to do. Or, it's the middle of the night, but they have decided that the important thing to do is to take a charcoal grill, put it in front of a window, and they're going to grill frankfurters. That's what they want to do. God is involved, and man is involved. Now, if that's true, the only kind of commandment that Buber is willing to accept is a commandment which you feel God wants you to do. And that's what makes him more Reform than Mordecai Kaplan. Because from Mordecai Kaplan's point of view, the commandments are really part of the people. And the tradition of the people and the things that the people did ought to carry weight with you. And Martin Buber says no. The first and foremost thing is not what the people has said and what the people has done, but your relationship with God. So if you say to Buber, may I turn on the television set on Saturday afternoon to watch a cultural program, the answer is, what kind of a question is that? What does God want of you? On the basis of your knowledge and feeling for what God is, you have to act as to what you think is right. And the same thing is with keeping kosher. And the same thing is with observing the second day of the holidays. And the same thing with wearing a hat or not wearing a hat, or going to synagogue or not going to synagogue, or anything else. That's the key. Now this, I think, will be a good point at which to stop, therefore, and examine what is good about this and what's bad about it. Because it's obvious that there are some things which are really quite wonderful about this, and there are also certain grave risks. And this, it seems to me, are the perils and the advantages of Reform Judaism. What is the advantage of this point of view? The great advantage of this point of view is that you are never asked to do anything against your conscience. Never. No one can ever tell you what to do. You decide. You make up your mind. And there will be no hypocrisy of any kind. You don't want to do it? Don't do it. You want to try it? Try it. You make up your mind. There is a second advantage to this point of view. It concentrates upon what is the major problem. And what is the major problem? The major problem is not, as Mordecai Kaplan would think, at least from Buber's point of view, our relationship with the Jewish people. That's only part of the problem. The real problem is we don't believe in God. How can you hope to have a Jewish religion with kashrus, without kashrus, with Shabbos and television, or without Shabbos and television, if you don't believe in God? What's the sense of having a committee on law and standards? What's the sense of separating the men and the women if neither the men and the women believe in God? And if nobody believes in God to begin with and thinks that God has no relationship to the law and standards? The key and the basic problem with being religious is sooner or later, do I have some relationship with God? When the Jewish people believed in God and the individual Jew had some knowledge of God, then they were willing to live by his law and die by his law, if necessary. But to try to have law without God, whether it's conservative law or Orthodox law, seems too much to ask of most people. We may get by with the traditions and the ceremonies for a generation or two, because our mothers did them or our grandmothers did them, and they still evoke a certain nostalgia and emotion to us. But how long can that go on? Another generation grows up and they don't know Yiddish, and another generation grows up and they don't even know the Yiddish words that the previous generation knew, and then the foods are no longer particularly Jewish, and the old emotions and the old mean nothing. Sooner or later, if you're going to have some kind of a Jewish religion, it has to have some real relationship to God. And of course, from the point of view of those who find Buber's interpretation of how God may be found and how one believes in God in our day useful, Buber has pointed the way toward an entire religion. And more than that, it's a kind of personal religious life which is far deeper and more traditional than anything that, for example, Kaplan talked about. For Buber, prayer makes sense. There is someone to pray to. Prayer is merely trying to bring forth and capture the person-to-person relationship. You tell God what's on your mind. And since God can't be pushed around, then God responds in whatever way he wants to. But it's not a response in Hebrew, nor in English. It's just the response of being there. That's prayer. to stand over against God and try to make what you feel and what you want clear to Him. The Bible becomes meaningful when it's read through Buber. You see that these men who walked through the pages of the Bible had certain experiences with God, which they wrote down in their human language. But there's an experience behind it. There is a sense and a knowledge of God which they have captured here. There is a whole sense of personal religious life. You're in trouble, you can talk to Buber's God. You're successful, which is a worse kind of trouble, you can also talk to Buber's God. This is a God that you can live with all the time, not some impersonable force working through the universe that may or may not care or be concerned with you. Now, these are the advantages, I think, of Buber's position. One could go on at some length. But what is the disadvantage? Seems to me there are two major disadvantages, and they are the problem of all of Reform Judaism. I'll take the last one first, or the one is more logical than the other, but I'll put it last, because I think it is the final problem. The big problem with this is, but supposing you end up with nothing. Supposing I decide God doesn't want me to keep Shabbos, He doesn't want me to keep kosher, He doesn't want me to observe Yom Kippur. What happened to Judaism? What happened to the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people? Now, Martin Buber, we are told by some people, is the kind of man who will eat chazer on Yom Kippur. Religiously. I mean, he doesn't have to eat chazer on Yom Kippur, but if he feels like eating chazer on Yom Kippur, he will eat chazer on Yom Kippur. What happened to the Jewish tradition? And isn't this the problem of all of Reform Judaism? First you change one thing, then you change another thing, then you whittle the whole thing away. Maybe by the time you are done making up your own mind what you want to do, you make up your mind that you want to do nothing. And then what's happened to the Jewish tradition? And secondly, you mean to say a person should have a right to make up his own mind on the basis of nothing? Without knowing the Jewish tradition, without understanding the Jewish tradition? After all, how can an ignorant individual, which is what most of us are Jewishly, decide what it is that God wants him to do? Shouldn't we rather rely upon the sages and the teachers and the philosophers? Well, Buber would say no on both counts. We shouldn't rely on the sages and the philosophers. For help, yes. But as a substitute for your conscience, no. And if it leads you outside of Judaism, then you're let outside of Judaism. All right. Let's not be afraid. The only way that Judaism can be restored is through you and your relationship to God. No, that doesn't mean you shouldn't study the Jewish tradition. You'd probably benefit by it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't know what the philosophers say. Of course it would help you. Buber himself has spent a whole lifetime studying the Bible and studying the Jewish philosophers, and as a matter of fact, studying other religions as well. Of course you should study. Any human being who wants to grow and develop should use his mind. It's an old Jewish tradition. But while it's helpful, it mustn't be a substitute for your personal relationship. To be a liberal Jew, you don't have to be ignorant. It would help, on the other hand, to be intelligent. It's true that for most people, being liberal is an excuse for doing less and less. That's quite correct. But so is being conservative. And for some people, being Orthodox is only an excuse for telling other people that they're not really Jewish at all. Every Jewish group has those who use it for their own personal advantage. Let's not take it at its worst level. Let's take it at its best. There is one thing in Martin Buber's way of thinking which might give some hope to those who would attempt to understand how Judaism might survive and develop through this experience. And that is Buber's notion that all religious experience is not just personal. One has to take into account history. We haven't spoken of history yet at all. We haven't spoken of unusual men or unusual moments in history which change almost everything. Buber is too much of a scholar and a man of the world, and particularly a student of Judaism, to leave history out. Sooner or later, you can't discuss Judaism without discussing history. And this is the question he asks. He asks himself, what is it that is the root and the basis of the Jewish relationship with God? Not just of the personal relationship with God now, which is mostly what we've been talking, but the Jewish relationship. Oh, says Buber, there is such a thing. There is a peculiar and unusual and unique moment in history There is the time when the Jewish people stood at Sinai, and something happened in history which never happened before and may never happen again. It certainly hasn't happened since. What is it? It is the experience that an entire people, not just an individual, but an entire people had this relationship with God. The Jews as a whole came to know God. And out of this they made God a pledge. They pledged God that they would serve Him and devote themselves to Him and His service throughout all of history. They would never forget Him or that moment. And they had the feeling that God, in response, pledged them that He would care for them and guard them and guide them throughout history. Unfortunately, not every single individual, because single individual Jews, even more than single Jews, have been lost through the ages. But the people as a whole, they felt would survive. This promise, this mutual promise growing out of this experience, is what we know as the covenant. The relationship between the Jewish people and God, which has persisted throughout the centuries. It's changed the form in which it's expressed itself. It has been different in different cultures in different times and places. But it is the promise of the Jew to his God which has carried on through the ages. Therefore, if our relationship to God is not just a relationship as individuals to God, but as members of the Jewish people who have such a covenant relationship, a promise made to God, then maybe what would keep us alive in our day is by helping the Jewish community, wherever it is, the Jewish people, to regain the sense of that relationship and to try to live by it. Now, from Buber's point of view, the only place where that can be done is where there is a real Jewish community, namely in the state of Israel. He believes that there it may be possible to create a Jewish community which lives that way. But I would like to ask the other question. Might it not be possible to create such a community anywhere? Is it necessary that Jews live only by themselves in a ghetto, whether the ghetto of the Middle Ages or the larger political ghetto, although I realize I'm being somewhat obnoxious, or the larger political ghetto called the State of Israel? Does it have to be an isolated existence which alone makes it possible for the Jews to recognize this relationship with God? Or is this a relationship to God which Jews might, if they were conscious of it and willing to understand it and willing to live by it, live out no matter where they were? Maybe Jewish identity can as easily be defined not only by being a Jewish citizen of the State of Israel, whatever that means, but by being one who believes in, who affirms, and who lives by the covenant. If one did this, one would try to be a member of the Jewish people, try to understand its tradition, try to live by that promise, and would therefore make one's decision about the television set, not just in terms of what one felt God wanted of one, but the question of turning on that television set on Shabbos afternoon would be a question of what does God want of me as a member of this covenant people, of the Jewish people, of the people which is trying to live out this relationship to God. Now the answer might be, I do turn it on, and the answer might be, I don't turn it on. And I don't think it would make any difference from this point of view. Not everybody would have to do the same thing, but everybody would have to have the same feeling, the same way of answering the question, the same way of asking the question. This is the one hope, I think, out of the sense of the Jewish people and its destiny, of its relationship to God, that it might be possible to find a real Jewish existence no matter where one was as a Jew, and particularly if one could find a few other Jews who shared it. But the real difficulty, the lasting difficulty with Buber's point of view, as well as with Reform Judaism, is supposing you can't be religious. Supposing you can't be religious, supposing after all the fancy talk of Mordecai Kaplan, and supposing after all this discussion of how Buber finds there's a God, supposing you don't find a God. maybe we'll all wake up and find out that there really isn't a God. And then what will happen to the Jewish people? What will happen to the whole Jewish way of life? And Buber would, I think, say at that point of view, if there isn't really a God, then there really shouldn't be a Jewish way of life, and there really shouldn't be a Jewish people. Maybe last for a little while and carry on its heritage. But all the good things of the Jewish people that are universal can be found elsewhere in the world. Ethics, you can find ethics. Sensitivity and aesthetics, you can find those too. He wouldn't be afraid of the risk. And this is what's so critical in our time. We are afraid to take the risk. We're afraid to go find out if God is really there. We are afraid to really try to ask the religious questions. We're afraid. We'd rather hold on to the little remnants of Jewishness that we have now, even though they disturb us, even though they don't make sense, even though they don't make a pattern. Because we're sure of them. We know where they were, and our mothers and our grandmothers and our grandfathers would recognize them, than to tackle the basic problem. What is the basic problem? The basic problem is, if we are going to be Jews, we are either going to be Jews in the state of Israel, or we're going to be Jews by virtue of a relationship to God. Either, therefore, we should go to the state of Israel, or find God, or stop being Jews. Hold on to what we want to, but don't expect it to last for very long. The Reform Jew is not afraid of that risk. He is not afraid that all his experimenting with whether you should use the electricity on Shabbos or not use the electricity on Shabbos, with whether or not one may ride to the synagogue or not ride to the synagogue, with whether one may have prayers in English or not have prayers in English, he is not afraid that that's going to take him out of Judaism. He worries about it. I think he's as worried about it as anybody else is. And he recognizes that all his experimenting and fooling around with the Jewish tradition may lead to the loss of Judaism. He admits that. But he feels that this is the only way the future can be won. The only way there can be a future for Judaism is if someone is willing to experiment. If someone is willing to risk everything to see if God is really there, and if what God wants of us can be a modern, advanced, developed pattern, and one which will have to change 20 years from now, even as it's changing now. That will not satisfy many people. Many people in the first place think that all these problems have been solved and are to be found in the tradition. And many people don't want to be that radical. It's too radical, too much risk, too much difficulty. They don't want to be responsible for the dissolution of Judaism. But some people do. Some people want to think it through, want to work it out, want to develop it, want to make it grow. And they belong with the Reform Jews and with Martin Buber, in my opinion. Where then do we stand at the conclusion? We stand before a great danger. We stand before the danger that Judaism is about to die. That the history of centuries is now about to come to an end. That the Jews of the state of Israel, if there should be a sneeze in the Kremlin or a bellyache in the White House, may be wiped off the face of the earth. Could happen in almost a moment. Be a magnificent fight, a heroic story, but betar it would be. Once again, a small handful of Jews being overwhelmed by the great forces which inhabit the universe would be terrible. It could happen. And the Jews in the United States, it's entirely possible that all this fancy talk about religion, particularly the kind of religion which we see around us today, and you can imagine how from Martin Buber's point of view as to what religion really is, the kind of religion most of us have stacks up, may all end in failure. Maybe the end of the Jewish pageant through history. And yet a Jew is stubborn. A Jew is stubborn. Why is he stubborn? He's stubborn because he's a Jew. Even though he doesn't understand quite what he is or where he stands, he knows that down through the centuries, this has always been the problem. Nothing could be more ridiculous than the survival of the Jew. Nothing. You remember that first evening we met. From a family to slaves, from slaves to nomads, from nomads to shepherds, from shepherds to cities, from cities to a coalition of tribes, from tribes to a kingdom, from one kingdom to two kingdoms, from two kingdoms into one kingdom, from one kingdom into exile, from exile into dispersion, through every kind of political and economic circumstances, and there are those Jews, they're still there. There is a kind of faith which one can have for Jewish survival. No proof, no way of knowing, no way of being certain, and no excuse for not doing our part. And where it will be, whether in the state of Israel, whether among the Orthodox Jews, whether among the Lubavitcher Orthodox Jews, or among the more respectable Orthodox Jews, whether among the more conservative Jews, or among the more liberal conservative Jews, or whether among the Reform Jews, or whether among none of them. We don't know. And there's no way of being sure. But at least we have some answers to go by. At least we know what the issues are. At least we know what's at stake. And at least you can make up your mind intelligent. At least you can search intelligent. At least the alternatives are before you. And finally, it comes down to the fact that a Jew has to make up his mind what being a Jew means to him. What being a Jew means to him. When Martin Buber was giving some lectures at Columbia, I asked him at the end of one of the sessions, I said to him, you know, Professor Buber, I think I said to him, you have said what it means to be a Jew in the state of Israel. What it means to try to create this sense of a covenant community there. But what about in the diaspora? What about for people like me who won't go to the state of Israel? And he looked at me and he answered with a Latin proverb which I didn't know. And he then translated and he said, in time of trouble or emergency, one calls on the triarii. 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 And then he said a few words. He said, the triarii were Roman troops. He says, and this is what people are in the diaspora today. They are the triarii of Jewish existence. So naturally, I dashed home to the encyclopedia, and I looked up the triarii, and there, God bless the Encyclopedia Britannica, they were. It seems that at certain stages of Roman military history, the troops were divided into three parts whose names I have forgotten, except for the third part. There were the first group of troops, the second group of troops, and the third group are called the triarii. I guess TRI, meaning third. The last group, I don't know, I'm just guessing, the last group of troops were called the triarii. When the battle was joined, the first group of troops went in to fight the battle. If the issue was in doubt, they committed the second group of troops. The only time the third troops ever went into battle was in case of absolute and utter emergency, in the face of imminent disaster. Then the triarii went in. And that's what Buber said it meant to be a Jew in the diaspora today. A Jew who wants to be a Jew in this modern world of ours is one of the triarii. He is one of the last troops left, of that few who are willing, for reasons that are not quite clear to anybody, to say, I'm a Jew. I want to be a Jew, even though I'm not quite sure what it means. I want to find out what it means. I want to live by it. No matter what anybody, that's my post, that's where I stand. Now the problem is, can we find such people? And the faith that one has in the Jewish history is that if we can't, maybe God can. And maybe some of us can be among those. Now we have a little time left for some questions. Yes?
Well, some of the things you said have gotten me off on a chain of thought, which may be a circle, but it seems to me as if it might come out somewhere as follows. Let me take your notes. If the encounter with God is a meeting of all of me with an existence something else, which I think was what you were suggesting as a possibility, and not just a part of me seeing some other part of me as certain naturalists talk about, then this God must have a specific nature which is similar in every encounter, because he's something else, he's always the same something else. Must be the same with everybody. In which case, it seems all the more obvious that my ability to draw any sensitive conclusion from this experience is at least very imperfect, because everybody draws a different conclusion each time, and even I draw a different conclusion each time I have such an encounter, if I ever have. So therefore, if one big value in this encounter, one of the ones, is, to have these commandments sort of emerge in me and my conscience, and then I can go out and be inspired to do the right things, it seems that it should behoove me to think on the side, not during the encounter, about this God's nature, what it is really like, so I can prepare for the encounter. And after the encounter, this is all part of the same thing though, it's almost over. And after the encounter, it seems to me I should, rationally think about what commandment I got, remove my own biases and weaknesses and so on. And the important thing is, if I'm going to do this and use my, thinking about it, I'll do this by studying the lives of the admirable people and the teachings of the wise people and so on. In other words, granting that the motivations that will lead me to have any commandments at all will come from some encounter at some stage of the game, which gives me some sort of faith. Once I have this faith, it seems to me I should, this is what will cause me to want to follow the law and imitate the prophets in whatever manner I can.
Yeah. Well, there's no objection really to what you say, even though I think you, I don't think you follow one part of the process quite properly. It's quite true that as a result of the encounter, any kind of a meeting that one has with God, one should use his mind. One has to think about it, because you don't have the encounter back at every moment. All you have left now is thought. I mean, I'm looking for God, but I can't find him. But I have a previous encounter. I have the sense of what that was. And out of that, I try to keep myself together until the encounter reappears. And if I find that my sense of the encounter of the meeting with God is the same of those of certain other people, I can obviously benefit from that. But remember, but I always look at what they wrote and what they said in the light of my experience, A. B. But part of what you said doesn't work. I forget the exact term that you use. The conclusion of the encounter, or the results of the encounter. You see, to be in such a circumstance is precisely not to have results. It is just meeting. There's nothing else there except me and God. And it's not a moment, in other words, when I am in love with a girl, when I am in a moment of understanding and communication with her, when I am in a moment of real friendship with her, this is not a point at which I can make judgments about the essence of her being.
Excuse me, you said that commandments, I thought you said commandments are a result of the encounter.
Are a result, but not the encounter. The encounter itself is not a commandment.
No.
No commandment is given. Nothing is given. Only the person.
Yes.
There she is, there I am. And that's all. Afterwards, I think about her, about what she was, about what she must be in order to make such a thing possible. But that's not what she is. That's my thinking.
Yes.
And the commandment is also after. It's after the fact.
Result. Yes.
The event itself is only there. Therefore, I can't go making comparisons with other people, because what they said they encountered is also after the fact. It may be of some help to me and of some interest to me. But no one ever describes what it is, and therefore you don't describe God, really. Because all that there is in such a meeting is you and God, and that's all. And if you try to find anything else, you are using your mind, or you are watching, and then you are broken up in two. But another thing that you said that requires saying about, it is not true that people have such widely differing experiences of God. To the contrary, while at one time it used to be so terribly fashionable to notice that this one said this and that one said that, what is it that is so different among them? Mostly their intellectualization about it, the way they talk about it, the descriptions, the rationale. There is a considerable body of, well, maybe unity is too strong a word, but there is a considerable body of experience with which I can identify in terms of my experience. While I wouldn't use that as proof of any kind that I'm on the right track, nonetheless, the experience of Jews in the Bible, not all, but many, the experience of many Christians, even the Muslims who have written in this regard, even people in other religions, is a kind of experience with which I can feel something of my own experience. And therefore, it's not that we wind up so totally different. Although it's true that very often people are tempted to think different ways and different things about what they have felt or come to know. Yes, sir?
I'm disturbed by just one idea in connection with...
Now, only one I settled.
Just one.
Please.
Does Buber really believe... I have heard him myself 4 times.
Yeah.
And the question never occurred to me. I took for granted that he didn't. Does he really believe that the encounter on Sinai should stop? He takes it literally?
No. He doesn't take it literally, but he takes it seriously. The words are words which people use to describe it. And they may therefore have certain errors in them, or the tradition may have been garbled over a period of time. But what did happen at Sinai? Nothing. I mean, is this Moses? You know, everybody likes to use Moses as if he were brought up on Madison Avenue. This was his trick to unify a slave people on their way to Israel. Yeah.
Well, there were 2 encounters
Yeah.
on that mountain. The whole Jewish people.
Yeah.
And Moses' person.
Yeah. He's talking about the whole Jewish people.
Now, I'll put the question in another way. First, for the whole Jewish people, he believes such a phenomenon that 600,000 people stood there and heard all this?
600,000 he doesn't say. In hearing, there is no hearing. Remember, this is a human way of describing communication in which there is no talking. When you really get to know somebody, you don't have to talk.
Maybe you can combine the answer to both.
Go ahead.
Because I think they are. Moses stood on top of the mountain, and then for himself he found second number of attributes, which he pronounced, directly addressed him.
Yeah.
This was a God.
Yeah.
Yeah. What does he think of that?
What does he think of it? He thinks it happened. Read his book Moses, which is now available in a paperback. It's a little more literalistic than I would do, but I think the basic point of view of what he says, you see, the question is, what difference does it make whether the covenant was made at one moment at Sinai, or as I would prefer to believe because of my historical training, over several centuries? See, no, he doesn't believe that. He believes it was renewed over several centuries. Now, from my point of view, rather than have the covenant made at a specific moment, it's easier for me to think of it as being gradually growing up among the people. Because that's, I've been trained in an evolutionary thinking, and I don't like too many miracles and specific events, so as a result, I prefer. But what difference does it make? The critical question is, what is the relationship of the Jewish people to God? And Buber says it is a relationship of promise, of pledge, of covenant. And this, I think, is a very...
Yeah, well, people make objections on the ground that that occur to me and to you too.
Yeah.
Now, how does he tackle the problem on the first day?
Again, this is a human being's way of describing what happened. Remember, that comes into the area, much of it, of scientific thought. And he's a liberal in this regard. He would say that this is an experience of God translated into scientific terms of a given time and place. No, he never takes the Bible literally, but he takes it seriously. I'll have to make the answers very brief.
To me, it's that all these branches shouldn't have recrimination against each other.
Correct.
Each one has, let's say, a piece of the truth, and let it go with that. Maybe
I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't say that each one has a little bit of truth, and therefore they ought to love one another, etc., etc. I would say that the one which I believe is the one which I believe to be most true. But the one in which I believe, what?
I think you could look at it that way too.
You have to, otherwise you stand up and say, well, they're a little true, and they're a little true, and they're a little true. And where are you? You're on the outside looking in. Don't be on the outside looking in. Where do you stand? Do you have a stand in Judaism? Take your stand. But wherever you stand, it will say one thing. You ought to love your neighbor, and that should include Jews. It's difficult sometimes, but it should. Last question.
I read Buber recently, and he seemed to take a hostile stand towards the state of Israel. He still advocated for a binational state, which was Judy Magnus's idea. Don't you think it's too late for that now?
That's a political question. And from Buber's point of view, politics ought to be subject to ethics. From Buber's point of view, the man with whom you have a relationship might just as well be an Arab as a Jew. And he doesn't see that it is ever too late to start establishing the kind of situation in which people learn to live with one another. It's quite correct, I think, is it not, to say that there is an unsolved moral and religious and even political problem between the Jews and the Arabs. And from Buber's point of view, we don't make it any easier by just talking about armaments. From his point of view, it would be a lot easier to try to actually proceed, whether the Arabs are ready for it or not, to a binational state. Now, you may think that's politically... Does the moral imperative change because the Arabs say the opposite? As a matter of fact, if you wanted to be a real political conniver, you could say, well, we know the Arabs won't accept it anyway, therefore we ought to come out for a binational state and show what wonderful people we are. That's not his point of view. He takes it seriously. He says, if you are going to live by what God tells you, mind you, he's a liberal, but you see his liberal religion he takes seriously. If you are going to live by what God tells you that you have to live in peace with the Arabs too. Therefore, why don't you do something about it? And what is more natural than to try to share the state with them? It's been very pleasant. Forgive me. I am terribly sorry, but I must go.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.